So, Richrd, you've been mentioning throughout this the classification rules, which must be applied when doing classification for devices. Could you tell us a little bit more about those particular rules?
Yeah, by all means. Now, the first thing I'll say within any system, it's really important that an organisation for each of their designs sits down and actually does a formal thing called a classification rationale. So it's a good discipline to get into, and it's really forces you to look at the product, its design, and its intended use and the intended users, and really and use that as part of going through the formal process of reviewing the classification rules that we're talking about. But our main criteria we're looking at here come under two broad headings here. We're interested in the duration of use, how long a product is being used on a patient for a patient contacting device. It's obviously not applicable to software. And the degree of invasiveness when we're talking about those contacting elements there. Once we've got that ahead and we understand we sort of need to go into this process of going through the rules. And going through the rules is a bit of discipline. It's something that we need to do, and it's something that can be quite constructive to an organisation just to feel your way through your thought process and really validate that you are where you think you are. So we've got those, and rule one is really, really simple, and it's talking broadly about non-invasive devices, the first set of rules we've got here. And non-invasive means they're not going into the body, so that's your bandages and things like that. And the first rule is really easy, and we like the first rule, and it says that non-invasive devices are class 1 unless one of the other rules applies. So they always have get-out clauses in there. So it forces us to go through and consider all the rules as we go through, and we should get into the discipline of doing that if at all possible. Rule 2 is a bit more complicated. It's still talking about non-invasive devices, and it's talking about specific cases here. And it's talking about for channeling and storing blood, body liquids, cell tissues, and those sorts of things for evaluation, eventual infusion, administration, or introduction into the body. Those are class 2A. So what we're talking about here is things like blood storage bags and things like that, or things that might have cells samples and things like that as we go through here. But this is what this rule is talking about. And they may be connected to an active medical device, class 2A or higher. And that's for reinfusion of products into people. And if they're intended for storing or channeling blood or other body liquids for storing organs, parts of organs, or body cells and tissues, except for blood bags, which are in class 2B, then in all other cases, they're in class 1. So it's quite complicated sentence there. They're actually saying that blood bags, as I mentioned earlier, things for storing blood and plasma and things like that, are class 2B medical devices. And it's giving us a specific case there. Why is it doing that? Because the consequence of failure of blood bags to blood transfusion services is absolutely massive. So we want a bit of focus on those ones, because historically we've had a bit of a problem with those. The rest of the rules apply as you would expect them to apply, as it's said there. We go on to rule 3. Devices intended to modify the biological chemical composition of human blood cells or other liquids intended for implantation or administration into the body are class 2B. So we've gone up a class here. Unless the treatment consists of filtration, centrifugation, or exchange of gases, heat, and so on, in which case they're in class 2A. So this is things when we're doing processes to these fluids we were talking about before. And these might be things like arterial filters, or things that are designed to warm the body and blood up or chill it for doing certain operations and procedures. it goes on here to say all non-invasive devices consisting of a substance or a mixture of substances intended to be used in vitro in direct contact with human cells, tissues, and organs shall be in class 3, and that includes human embryos and things like that. So these are all the materials that might be used in things like cell culture for stem cell growth, doing scaffolds, or in human embryology, IVF materials there as well. So they're all class 3 products because they're seen as pretty vital to get right and very big impact if you get them wrong. So we'll always have caveats as we go through these rules. So it's really important to read them through in a great deal of detail. It's also really important when you're reading those and the detail in these to be aware that the intended use of your product and the way your users actually use the product may change over time, which may change the classification of your product as well. So be aware of your classification when it comes to doing post-market surveillance, because it's complicated. Rule 4 talks about non-invasive devices which come into contact with skin or mucous membranes. And this is talking about the bandages we used as an example earlier. So you can see they're class 1 if they're a mechanical barrier or for compression or absorption of exudate. So that's your bandage or something that straps your knee up after an injury. Those are class 1 devices. But here's the class 2B example that I mentioned earlier. If they are intended to use principally for injuries to the skin which have breached the skin or mucous membrane and can only be healed by secondary intent. Secondary intent means it's a really, you've really got to get in there to make it heal up. It's not going to do it by itself. They're class 2B. In other cases, if they're maintaining an environment that helps healing, they're class 2A product. The rule applies to invasive devices that come into contact with injured mucous membranes. That's if for packing the mouth and things like that as well. Those will be the sorts of products that would fall underneath that. So that's non-invasive devices. And you can see there's quite a lot of complexity and range of products that fit within that definition already. Then we move on to invasive devices. So an invasive device, as defined in Rule 5, is something that it comes in via a body orifice. So these are the sorts of products like urinary catheters would fall under Rule 5. These are the ones that can be used in there. And you can see there's a caveat there whether they're connected to an active device. And class 1, if they're intended for transient use, so that would be something like an intermittent catheter that's used periodically. Class 2A, if they're for short-term use. And you can see here some definitions about, except if they're used in the oral cavity or the pharynx or the ear canal, in which case they're class 1. So those are seen as less risky areas. So they get a bit of a downgrader there. 2B, if they're intended for long-term use, so that would be any period greater than 30 days. But again, you can see that's been downgraded for things that go into the oral cavity, the ear, or other body orifices like that. They're seen as lower risk, and so they get downgraded to a 2A. Very clear in this rule how that all works. All invasive devices with respect to body orifices other than surgically invasive devices intended for connection to active devices are class 2A basically. Is the caveat. There's always a caveat at the end just to sweep up all the things they didn't think of when they put the rules together. Rule 6 is talking about surgically invasive devices. And it's saying here's the top one here, the class 3s. Things that are intended to diagnose, monitor, or correct a defect of the heart or the central circulatory system. They're class 3 products because they've got that really invasive critical contact with the patient. Reusable surgical instruments are class 1s. We've already discussed them. Devices intended specifically, an important word specifically, for use in direct contact with the heart or central circulatory system or the central nervous system are in class 3. So if you're making an instrument, specifically a neurological instrument or a heart instrument, a heart clamp or something like that, yeah, that's going to be a class 3 product. Are intended to supply energy in the form of ionizing radiation. So this could be things like X-rays and things like that would start falling under this 2B definition. Have a biological effect or are wholly or mainly absorbed. So this could be things with coatings and materials that might be absorbed into the body, things like some sorts of sutures. It could be coatings on materials like hydroxyapatite. Coatings could make this a class 2B product if it doesn't get a higher classification elsewhere. And are intended to administer medicinal products, pharmaceuticals, by means of a delivery system. If this is done in a manner that is potentially hazardous, taking into account the mode of application, in which case they're class 2B. That covers the majority of automated drug delivery systems, things like infusion pumps and things like that, which could be used to put medicinal products in. They would fall under that rule there. Okay, so it's getting quite complicated. We're expanding our list of products that we can cover here as we go through these rules. Rule 7 goes on to talk about surgically invasive devices for short-term are class 2A. But again, we can see that this emphasis on contact with the central circulatory system and the central nervous system moves the classification up to a class 3. Again, it's a bit of a repeater, intended to supply energy in the form of ionizing radiation. Again, class 2B, consistent with rule 6. Biological effect makes us a class 3 as well. And here we have are intended to undergo chemical change in the body, except for devices are placed in the teeth or to administer medicines in which they are class 2B. So that's saying that things like dental amalgams that actually transform and go solid to make tooth fillings, they're class 2B, not class 3. They're going through a change, but they're seen as a lower risk classification there. So we've got a bit of those sorts of products come into that caveat of a lower classification there. Rule 8 talks about implantable devices and long-term surgical devices. This is generally things that are going to be in your body for over 30 days. They start off as a 2B. Again, we've got stuff that's going to be implanted on the teeth. This could be things like braces and things like that. They're class 2A in that first bit there. Again, we've got exactly the same thing we saw in the previous rules. We've got the references to the central nervous system, materials with biological effect, and the administration of medicinal products that move everything up to class 3 in those areas. We also have active implantable devices and their accessories. So these are powered things like implantable pumps and defibrillators, class 3. And we've got some here which are very topical, which have come into the medical devices regulations because of scandals. We've got specific mention here about breast implants following the PIP breast scandal. They're class 3 as well and get that high level of scrutiny. And we have also surgical meshes, which are being used to treat urinary incontinence in women especially, and there have been a lot of problems in those areas, and I'm sure you're aware of the problems. They get class 3 treatment as well. We mentioned partial or total joint replacements. They're in class 3, we've already mentioned. We have an exception for things like screws, wedges, plates, and instruments. Those are the sort of things you'd use to treat a trauma case. So they're seen as lower risk because they don't have an articulating surface. They don't wear out, basically. So they're a little bit, they're a bit there. Spinal bits are class 3, as we probably expect them to be. But again, exceptions for those ancillary materials like the screws, wedges, plates, and instruments that go with it. They don't become class 3 with that, and they're specifically excluded there. Once we've done that, we get into active devices. And active devices are a very interesting area. And it says all active therapeutic devices intended to administer or exchange energy are class 2A, unless their characteristics and they may administer or exchange energy to or from the human body in a potentially hazardous way, taking into account the nature, density, and site of application of the energy, in which case they're class 2B. So rule 9 is the first one where you're being asked to make a judgment about how risky the application of your product is. If you've got one of these active therapeutic devices, something like a surgical laser is a good example of that. It could be a radiotherapy device. These are all active devices which are exposed using radiation or something like that to affect a treatment. You really need to be thinking about, how dangerous it can be. Where am I applying this radiation? And obviously, there's a big difference between applying that sort of radiation to your hand or to your head. So you need to really understand what your product's intended use is. And just note that all active devices intended to emit ionizing radiation for therapeutic purposes, including devices which control and monitor devices, are all class 2B. So, we're recognizing a risk here, and we're saying if you've got this ionizing radiation, you're going to be a class 2B device. All active devices that are intended for controlling, monitoring, or directly influencing the performance of active implantable devices are class 3. So that's controllers and things like that, because, you imagine an external controller that's being used to set a heart defibrillator or one of those, pacemaker or something like that. They're class 3 products because their performance is absolutely critical to the successful use of that product. So they get pulled in there. Rule 10 comes in here, and this is one that, I notice I've highlighted and monitoring in this first saying here. Active devices intended to diagnose and monitor a class 2A. If they're intended to supply energy, they're class 1. Like a light is a class 1 device, something like a surgical gantry light that's being used in surgery. And we go through here and see they're intended to allow direct diagnosis or monitoring of vital physiological process, unless they're specifically intended for monitoring of vital physiological parameters where the nature of variations could result in immediate danger to the patient. And you're going to have to wade your way through that wording that if you've got a product that's sort of falling under Rule 10, does your product monitor vital physiological processes, and could getting it wrong cause a risk to life? And they come into class 2B. This pulls a lot of products that may have previously been class 1 products into requiring a notified body. It's especially impacts or could be applied to some things, some active devices and software devices or software controlling devices. But we'll read on, we'll see there's other stuff mentioned there as well as we go forward. So Rule 10 is talking about monitoring products. Rule 11 moves us on specifically to the use of software. And it's the software rule for want of anything else here. And again, it's asking you here to software intended to provide information which is used to make decisions with diagnostic or therapeutic purpose is a class 2A. So it's going to be reviewed by a notified body, except if such decisions have an impact that may directly, indirectly cause death or irreversible state of health, class 3. So you've got to understand the consequences of your product going on. Serious deterioration of health or requirement for surgical intervention, class 2B. And here's a kicker. Software intended to monitor physiological processes is in class 2A, except if it's intended for monitoring of vital physiological parameters where the nature of variations, notice the repeat from Rule 10, is such that it can result in immediate danger to the patient, in which case it is class 2B. All other software is class 1. I've struggled to find any software that falls into class 1, because if it's not monitoring something or doing something, I'm not entirely certain why you've got it. But I'm sure there's an example out there somewhere. Rule 12, this talks about active devices intended to administer or remove medicinal products, body liquids, and other substances from the body, class 2A. So you're beginning to see, as we look at more things here, that could be describing something like an infusion pump, which is intended to administer or remove medicinal products. Talked about those things already. So as you read through, multiple classification rules could apply to products. What you've got to do as you go through here is take the conservative approach. Take the highest risk classification applied to your product. It is always better for your notified body to be telling you you've overclassified a product than underclassified, because that can lead you to some problems going forwards. But again, and we get a little bit of repetition as we go through here. It's consistent though. Rule 13s are catch-all for the end of these active devices. It said everything else you haven't thought of. If you haven't managed to fit it into any of those rules, you're a class 1. This takes us into an interesting area of special rules. And these are really designed to mop up all the other things that haven't been covered in other elements we've been doing here. So Rule 14 talks about devices that have a medicinal product, which is incorporated in them, and stuff that might be derived from human sources like blood or plasma, which action is ancillary to that of the device, are in class 3. And that's things like medical devices that are coated with heparin would come under that. So heparin's been added in there. It's derived from human materials, potentially. It's a pharmaceutically active medicinal product. It's on there to reduce blood clotting. In a medical device, it's not there that's not its primary function. So it's an ancillary function to help the medical device work better. But it's still a class 3 as soon as you add these materials in. So you've got to be very careful about what you add in with products and whether they are pushing it into this category. And there's a series of rules around the incorporation of medicinal products into these sorts of materials into products, and how you have to relate to your notified body with that. Fairly complicated. If you have got these materials, really delve into that a little bit more with your regulatory department. 15 talks about contraceptive devices, and it says basically things that to stop the sexually transmitted diseases and so on are in class 2B, unless they're implantable, in which case they're class 3. And that covers things like IUDs, because again, we have a history of these devices malfunctioning and they're getting a class 3 things because we want to make sure they're safe for the women who use them. Rule 16 talks about contact lenses, and this is for disinfecting, cleaning, rinsing, and hydrating contact lenses, and they're all class 2B, because if you're sticking something in your eye, you pretty well want it to be right. So they get a higher classification for doing that. It also talks about devices which are going to be using for disinfecting or sterilizing medical devices. So this could be something like a benchtop sterilizer in a dentist surgery. Equally could apply to washing and sterilizing equipment that's used in hospitals. Those are all medical devices and fall under the medical devices regulations as class 2A and need to be CE marked in accordance with those requirements. It does not apply to devices intended to clean devices other than contact lenses by means of physical action. That's a long-winded way of saying it doesn't apply to brushes. So we don't have to worry about cleaning brushes, but we need to worry about the other things that we have in there. Rule 17 is about diagnostic imaging and images, so that's DICOM systems that capture images and handle them around. Those are class 2A medical devices. They get a higher risk classification than you might otherwise think, because it's really important the right X-ray, unaltered, goes to the right patient file and is reviewed correctly by the doctor. It's one of the most important thing about diagnostic imaging. We need to make sure the right image goes with the right patient. 18 talks about devices manufactured with tissues of human or animal origin. It's sort of a caveat to the medicinal one we talked about earlier. And it's basically saying that if we're using human or animal materials to make a product, they're class 3 as well. A good example of that is we tend to use porcine-derived ligament materials to do things like repair the rotator cuff, the shoulder, which common golfing injury. The material to doing that is usually derived from porcine origins, and that would make it a class 3 device. You can see how that would apply to a lot of sort of top-end medical devices as well. 19 talks about nanomaterials. Again, it asks you to make a judgment about the risks associated with this. And if you do have a product that incorporates or has nanomaterials associated with this, look at this very carefully and look at the published literature that's out there that looks at the risks associated with the type of nanomaterial and the particle sizes you have. But basically, if you've got nanomaterials there, it's at least a class 2A. But if the exposure level is at the higher end of the spectrum, you could be as high as a class 3 for nanomaterials. A lot of products out there who utilize this technology now. So really important if you're working in that area. 20 talks about all invasive devices with respect to body orifices other than surgically invasive devices, which intended to administer medicinal products by inhalation are class 2A. So that's what it sounds like. That's inhalers. So here we've got a special rule that talks about inhalers and says they're class 2A. Unless their mode of action has an essential impact on the efficacy and safety of the medicinal product, in which case they're class 2B. So critical inhalation devices are really important for infusing and getting the right dose of medicine into the patient. If that's critical, that could go up to a class 2B. But that's all inhaled medicines there. That's rule 20. 21 talks about materials that are introduced into the body and may be absorbed or locally dispersed. And it says they're class 3 if their products of metabolism are systematically absorbed by the human body in order to achieve their intended purpose. Not many products fall into that, but you can maybe think up some products that would fit under that. So, for example, a good example of that would be hydroxyapatite, which is a coating in orthopedic implants, which is there and dissolves to encourage bone ingrowth into the implant to stabilize it. The product's already is a class 3, but if it wasn't, it is again, because we do that. So you can imagine an orthopedic screw that would be a class 2A device, potentially, can become a class 3 device if it's covered in hydroxyapatite, as an example there. And here's we have class 3 if their intended purpose in the stomach or lower gastrointestinal tract, and they or their products of metabolism are systematically absorbed by the human body. If you do fall under this regulation, finding out whether the material or materials of metabolism is actually systematically absorbed can mean a lot of research. So I warn you about that one. And here are the classifications, class 2B in all other cases, except if they're applied to skin, in which case they're class 2A. If they're applied in the nasal or oral cavity, as far as the pharynx, and achieve their intended purpose in those cavities, they're class 2A. That's, again, dental treatments coming in there that may have a level of absorption. So you can see we're really trying to cover a vast range of products here. Really, really are. And finally, we have Rule 22. And this talks about active therapeutic devices with an integrated diagnostic function, which significantly determines the patient management by the device. So basically, this is where we have the device making up its own mind how it's going to treat the patient. These are class 2 devices. And the really, really obvious one you've probably seen around you in the community are automatic defibrillators, which you attach to the patient. They take a reading of the patient's heart condition and will administer defibrillation shock to the patient based on their own internal software. Class 3 products, because if they go wrong, they go really wrong, and obviously being administered in a critical situation. Other things like artificial pancreas systems, which take blood glucose readings and then determine the amount of insulin the patient's going to have for class 1 diabetics, would also fall under this rule as class 3 devices. So that's the last rule, Alex. There's a lot of them, aren't there?
Yes, there are. There's quite a lot of rules for people to keep on top of.
Very much so. It's a very, very complicated area to go through. I hope I've given you just a really brief overview of this today. It's really important you sit down with your designers and your regulatory professionals to go through these really systematically and document your thinking and the reason you've chosen your classification for your product very clearly. And I hope I've also demonstrated it's important to look all the way through here and really determine whether one or more rules can apply to your product based on its intended use and your design there. So